What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. Woo! We've got Errol Spence Jr., 27 wins and 0 losses, defending his WBC and IBF welterweight titles against Yordenis Ugas. 27 wins and 4 losses, and Yordenis Ugas will be defending his WBA super welterweight title. And not super welterweight as in a division above welterweight. I mean super as in not the regular title, but the super title, which Yordenis Ugas first won as a vacant regular title in a fight against Abel Ramos, and then it was upgraded to super when Manny Pacquiao was stripped of his WBA super welterweight champion status. So 3 of the 4 welterweight belts are on the line here, and Errol Spence is coming in obviously as the A side. He's the undefeated champion who, we first saw, coming up the ranks, and there was a little bit of folklore in terms of, Errol Spence dropped Floyd Mayweather in sparring. His name was buzzing early in his professional career, and then we started seeing some of his fights being televised on some pretty prominent undercards. We saw him beat like Chris Van Heerden, Phil Logreco, Samuel Vargas. He was more or less just mowing through these guys, knocking just about all of them out. I mean, till this day, like 21 out of his 27 wins are via knockout or TKO stoppage. And these wins started getting more and more impressive to where we saw him pretty much obliterate Chris Algieri via 5th round TKO. And then he knocked out Leonard Bundu, who at the time I think had only 1 loss, and it was via decision to a then prime Keith Thurman. Well, Errol Spence Jr. stopped Leonard Bundu via knockout, devastating knockout in the 6th round. So by this point, it's like, okay, Errol Spence is really looking like the real deal, kind of like a composed, patient hunter who is a southpaw, and he's kind of trapping his opponents, controlling the fight, first of all, with the jab, but then more or less trapping them against the ropes, and then deploying his left hands to the body. Devastating power and enough skill to really make that power work for him round over round. So after those, back-to-back knockout wins against Chris Algieri and Leonard Bundu, he then has a challenge for Kell Brook's IBF welterweight title. And this was at the time when Kell Brook, along with, I would say, Keith Thurman, were pretty much seen to be the class of the welterweight division in the, we'll call it the post-Floyd Mayweather era. Well, Kell Brook had challenged 2 divisions up, the champion at middleweight, Gennady Triple G Golovkin, in one of the most ill-advised managerial fight management moves I think I have ever seen. Now, Kell Brook was undefeated at the time that he fought Triple G, but he thought he was being ducked at 147. Triple G was more or less being ducked at 160. So Kell Brook's like, all right, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to fight the monster, Triple G. And it did not turn out well. He broke his orbital bone in an otherwise spirited few round fight. He was looking good, kind of tagging Triple G in the early rounds. Triple G just kind of uncharacteristically came at him, trapped him against the ropes, and put a beating on him to where the corner threw in the towel, and it was like a mid-round stoppage. I believe 5th round TKO for Triple G over Kell Brook. And then Kell Brook came all the way back down to welterweight to defend his IBF title against the rising contender, Errol Spence Jr. If you want a similarity, look at the way that Jerome Boots Ennis and Virgil Ortiz are kind of viewed today, where you wouldn't even really expect, the Errol Spence today or Terence Crawford today to fight these up-and-comers. Not that they can't beat them. It's just one of those, why would I want to fight this guy if I don't have to? They're not bringing in like the top dollar, so they would rather be fighting the big names like a Manny Pacquiao. And there's obviously high risk in fighting these surging contenders. Well, that's exactly what Errol Spence was at the time that Kell Brook defended his IBF title against him. And this is one of the best fights of 2017. I mean, Kell Brook was actually getting off first, maybe flashing the faster hand speed, where he was kind of countering Errol Spence's, southpaw stance and the way that Errol Spence likes to control the fight with his lead right hand. I mean, he's throwing a lot of jabs, but even when he's not throwing jabs, he's He's kind of guiding his opponent's head. He's using angles. Like, Errol Spence is a very underrated mover. Look at the way that he kind of pivots and moves laterally and circles. So he'll basically start blinding you by throwing the jab or even probing with the jab hand, the right jab, and kind of messing with your head and just kind of controlling where your feet are going to be positioned, so then he could kind of step around and then throw like a left hand to the body, like a scooping, scraping left hand to the body. Well, Kell Brook was kind of offsetting this by shooting a lead right hand, and it was catching Errol Spence in the middle and early rounds. But then through attrition and what I kind of see as being, you know, a weight depletion issue in this particular fight for Kell Brook, Errol Spence started to take over the fight in the later middle rounds, like we're talking 6, 7, to where he eventually stopped Kell Brook via 11th round knockout. And in this fight, Kell Brook actually broke his other orbital bone. So that's back-to-back fights for Kell Brook, where he breaks one against Triple G, then the other against Errol Spence. Pretty much a nightmare scenario. You can't get any more unfortunate in back-to-back fights. I mean, that's kind of the cost of such a spirited effort in some cases, unfortunately. And I don't think Kell Brook's career ever fully recovered from those back-to-back tough fights and with disastrous bodily facial results. So that is how Errol Spence first captured a belt. It was the IBF belt, and then he defended it first against Lamont Peterson, where he pretty much just put a round-over-round beating on the former 140-pound champ Lamont Peterson. Ended up stopping him in the 7th round. I mean, and this was one of those fights where Lamont Peterson was showing so much guts, and he had, I think, just come off a win over, I want to say, David Avanesian. And so Lamont Peterson wasn't as good as he was at 140, but he was still a formidable 147-pound fighter, and Errol Spence really beat him down and stopped him again by the 7th round. So this didn't even make it into the late rounds. And then after that, he knocked out Carlos Ocampo in the 1st round, and then he fights Mikey Garcia in a fight where Mikey Garcia really didn't have any business being in the ring with the welterweight champion at the time. I never was really buying Mikey Garcia at anywhere above 135. I wish Mikey Garcia had fought Vasily Lomachenko. I think that that was like the super fight that never happened. And Mikey Garcia, again, he had won a belt at 140 against Sergey Lipinets, but 147 just isn't the class for Mikey Garcia, although he did beat Jesse Vargas via decision. But yeah, he couldn't ever really get going against Errol Spence Jr. And this was a fight where a lot of people thought that Mikey Garcia had a good chance of winning this one. In fact, online boxing analyst Richard Dwyer actually picked Mikey Garcia to beat Errol Spence. But Errol Spence kind of showed a dimension in his game that many didn't think he had. And that was, you know, we had seen that he had a good jab, but the way that he was using it and kind of fighting off his back foot against Mikey Garcia, we seen him be the patient hunter looking to trap and kill, you know, behind the jab, but we hadn't seen him basically fight kind of backing up and circling and just using the jab as the primary weapon, throwing it time and time again, where you're not letting the left hand go as much and you're not doing as much stalking, even though he did end up stalking Mikey Garcia to where it started getting a little ugly. But it wasn't like one of those visibly disastrous beatdowns, but it was one of the most dominant 12-round efforts you can imagine, to where it's really hard to even give Mikey Garcia a round or two in this one. Total dominance. Errol Spence Jr.'s reputation only grew with that performance, and then he fought Shawn Porter in what was, at this point, besides maybe the Kell Brook fight, the toughest fight of Errol Spence's career, because this was one of the fights where round by round, it was kind of anyone's guess going into, say, the 10th and 11th round who was winning the fight, because Errol Spence really couldn't dictate the terms of the exchange the way that he normally does. He usually exchanges on his terms because his right lead hand is one of the most dominant weapons in the sport. No, it isn't like a vanquishing punch like Deontay Wilder's straight right hand or a Manny Pacquiao left hand, but the way that he's able to control fights, again, not only by pumping the jab, but by leading you and by using it to blind, to kind of tap your hand and kind of control your glove so then you could do different things motion-wise and angles-wise. Look at some of the subtleties in Errol Spence's lead right hand and all the things that he does with it, as well as his underrated footwork. It's like, because Errol Spence isn't somebody who bounces around the ring, people figure that he's like either flat-footed or he doesn't flash some of the best feet in the game. But the way that he is economical in his movement, I think that he's got some of the best footwork and some of the best balance in the sport of boxing, pound for pound. Look at how he uses his legs, either with the wide stance to be able to step and pivot and basically be able to beat you to the spot angles-wise, to where he gets like a free left hand to the body or a sweeping lead right hook over the top, or then he's able to shoot the left hand straight to the body, because again, he's got the scraping left to the body and the straight left to the body. And once you think that it's all body shots, he tags you up top with either a looping left hand or a straight left hand. But this is all predicated around the use of his right hand, his lead right hand. So against Shawn Porter, he wasn't able to control the fight with his right like he normally does. So this was just a trench warfare style fight where Porter's jumping in and they're both just letting their hands go, exchanging pretty much throughout the round over round. So again, going into the 10th round, it's like, damn, did you give Shawn Porter that round? Did you give Errol Spence that round? Well, Errol Spence dropped Shawn Porter late in the fight, and I truly believe that that was the difference on the scorecard. As it was, Errol Spence won a split decision win over Shawn Porter. This was the first time that he didn't either win via knockout nor unanimous decision. This was a split decision win over Shawn Porter. Super close fight. One of those like 115, 113, 114, 114 style fights where, again, the knockdown in my book, and if you look at the scorecards, it kind of merits this. The knockdown was the difference in that one. And it came at a super timely moment for Errol Spence Jr. Very, very good fight. That one is worth a rewatch. But after that fight, Errol Spence now holds the IBF and WBC title because Shawn Porter came into Errol Spence versus Shawn Porter with the WBC belt. So this was a title unification fight. Errol Spence comes out with 2 out of the 4 welterweight belts, and then he gets in the devastating car accident where, you know, at the time of the news, it's like, damn, is this going to totally ruin Errol Spence's career? Is his life ever going to be the same? We hear about fighters in these accidents sometimes. I mean, rest in peace, Diego Corrales lost his life in a motorcycle accident, and Paul Williams ended up becoming paralyzed in a motorcycle accident. Well, this was like a drop top, speeding on the highway, drunk driving type of accident for Errol Spence Jr. He got launched from his drop top and somehow miraculously was able to return to the ring in less than a year against Danny Garcia. No tune-up fight. He's going right in against Danny Garcia. And at the time of the fight, I believe I picked Danny Garcia to win this via decision. I'd have to go back and look, but I think I picked Danny Garcia to win a close decision over Errol Spence Jr. just because I was thinking it would be a minor miracle for Errol Spence to come back from such a devastating accident because, again, he didn't suffer any broken bones, just some tissue damage and some facial lacerations and cuts and things of that nature, but nothing that on its surface is necessarily career-ending or even career-threatening, which is a minor miracle. And it's weird. I see a lot of people saying, oh, you know, people are making too much of this accident, blah, blah, blah. Get over it. He's fine. He's fine. Well, okay, if he ends up being truly okay, which he did perform his ass off against Danny Garcia, and he beat Danny Garcia via unanimous decision, and Danny Garcia is no pushover. He, at the time, one of the elites in the division, I would say 4th, 5th, 6th best fighter in the division. Well, okay, if Errol Spence truly is recovered from that accident and it doesn't end up impacting his performance, his career to any real degree, okay, but let's not act like that wasn't a very improbable minor miracle. Or like, oh, of course he was going to recover and be okay. Because what? Because he's Errol Spence? He's a human being at the end of the day, and he got launched from a high-speed car and, you know, it knocked his teeth out, you know? And maybe the fact that he wasn't wearing a seatbelt ironically saved his life. But this is a very unusual type of recovery. Well, as I said, he then fights Danny Garcia, where a lot of people have question marks, then a lot of people don't have question marks. You've got, you know, a couple different camps in terms of guessing how Errol Spence is going to look in his return to the ring. And again, he ended up beating Danny Garcia. I didn't see the same type of dominance with the right hand, but by the late rounds, middle to late rounds, he really started to seize control, putting combinations together, really blasting Garcia to the body. You started to see Danny Garcia's confidence kind of wane as the rounds continued. continued. Like, damn, I really can't get through to this guy, nor can I get him to break character and to drop his guard to where Danny Garcia, could land something big, because he's looking to land that signature left hook or a very hard straight right. He was able to land some really nice shots against Errol Spence. Errol Spence was just able to land a little bit more. Errol Spence was not as dominant on the CompuBox numbers as he normally is. Like, if you compare Errol Spence's performances against like a Lamont Peterson or, Mikey Garcia, obviously, but say Lamont Peterson, the punch stats, at least through the first half of the fight, were very competitive between Spence and Danny Garcia. But the eyeball test, as you're watching the fight, you see Errol Spence looking like he's more or less in control. So yeah, this was a very impressive decision win for Errol Spence against Danny Garcia. So that kind of answered the questions. Well, I guess Errol Spence does appear to be back. Well, then he ends up securing one of the biggest fights that you can imagine. So in the summer of 2021, he was supposed to fight Manny Pacquiao, which by far would have been like the best fight of 2022 in terms of on paper, what is the biggest matchup. This would have probably exceeded, Canelo versus Caleb Plant, Wilder Fury 3, Joshua Usyk, Canelo versus Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith, which was actually December of 2020. But this would have been the biggest fight on paper. Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence Jr. And then Errol Spence Jr. unfortunately had to pull out of that fight due to a retina tear, which he then got operated on. So he had the surgery for it. That was one of the most disappointing occurrences in boxing in 2021. Yordenis Ugas ends up being the late replacement for Errol Spence Jr. and ends up beating Manny Pacquiao and basically taking all of the juice that was supposed to go to Errol Spence. Like, this was supposed to be the super high profile fight. Not that Errol Spence hadn't already had high profile fights. I mean, he had performed on pay-per-view multiple times already, but he didn't have a name like the legendary Manny Pacquiao. Well, again, enter Yordenis Ugas, and Ugas beats Pacquiao via unanimous decision. So it's kind of funny that these guys find themselves on this collision course for 3 of the 4 belts. But Yordenis Ugas is one of those guys. He's out of Cuba. Cuba notoriously has a very esteemed boxing legacy, reputation over the several decades. And it's kind of interesting. The country of Cuba just allowed their citizens to box professionally again. So they don't need to defect from their native Cuba to participate in professional boxing. Like, for all the great Cubans we've seen step into the ring, from Erislandy Lara to Joel Casamayor to Luis Ortiz to Guillermo Rigondeaux, and I mean, the list goes on. There's so many, but we've actually gotten a small representation out of the talent that is Cuba-based, because only a fraction of them ever made it to the States or elsewhere to fight professionally. Like, if it wasn't for Cuba's non-participation in professional boxing, we would have seen the great Teofilo Stevenson probably fight Muhammad Ali at some point, because he was a 3-time Olympic gold medalist and he was one of the biggest names in boxing, but he never fought professionally because of the international relations. Well, that is about to change. So hopefully we see much more of the brilliant talent that Cuba has to offer in the boxing realm. But Yordenis Ugas is a Cuban fighter, and he was pretty much under the radar because he lost a few of his early fights. He was like 15-3 at one point. He lost to Amir Imam, he lost to Emmanuel Robles, and this was back in 2014. But since that fight, he started to go on a nice run where he beat Jamal James, who we just saw lose a very good fight to Butayev, who's about to fight Stanionis on this Spence Ugas undercard. But Ugas was coming up, beating Jamal James, beating Thomas Delorme, who we just saw get stopped by Jerome Boots Ennis. He had gotten stopped by Terence Crawford prior to that. But Delorme is a pretty good fighter. Ugas beat him via unanimous decision. He stopped Ray Robinson, this was on a pretty prominent undercard, and that Delorme against Ugas fight was on a big undercard too. That was on Floyd Mayweather versus Conor McGregor undercard. So Ugas starts racking up some higher and higher profile wins. Again, he stopped Ray Robinson, and then he fights Shawn Porter, where Shawn Porter is clearly the A side, and this ends up being way more than Shawn Porter bargained for, where this was such a difficult fight for Porter, where we're used to seeing him jump in the pocket and again kind of say, no, I'm going to bring the fight to your chest and you can't do anything about me jumping in and throwing my hands. Whether I'm smothering my own punches, I'm also smothering your punches, so you're not going to be landing super cleanly against me. Basically, Shawn Porter could muddy the waters against damn near anybody and make the fight a very trench warfare style fight. Well, Yordenis Ugas' ability to counterpunch, and he's got an orthodox stance, but he throws like a nice right counter uppercut, and he'll throw a left uppercut. He throws sweeping punches, keeps a high guard, throws straight punches as well. Nice crisp combinations. He's not the fastest fighter. He doesn't move his head a ton. Neither does Errol Spence. They more so step out of the way. Well, I'll say Errol Spence usually steps out of range or he'll duck. So he'll either control the distance, the range, and avoid punches that way, or he'll duck your punches up top. Yordenis Ugas keeps a high guard, so he'll step in the pocket, keeping the high guard, letting you throw your punches, and then he'll start countering up the middle. Very economical in his movement as well. This is going to be a very interesting chess match, if you will. But Yordenis Ugas versus Shawn Porter, or should I say Shawn Porter versus Yordenis Ugas, was super close and competitive. Some people think that Yordenis Ugas deserved the decision win here. Well, Shawn Porter won via split decision. But even in that loss, it grew Yordenis Ugas' reputation to where people are saying, keep your eye on this guy. Well, after that, he beats Omar Figueroa Jr., giving him his first career loss. And then he beats Mike Dallas Jr. via 7th round knockout. And then he beats Abel Ramos. That's where he won that vacant WBA regular welterweight title, and then he fights that super fight as a late replacement against Manny Pacquiao, where, yes, Manny Pacquiao is 42 years old, and I mean, what can you say? Manny Pacquiao was just outgunned, outboxed. Yordenis Ugas was stronger than him. He had an answer for when Manny Pacquiao likes to kind of create that cyclone of activity where he jumps in and likes to throw, 4 to 6 punch combinations. Yordenis Ugas had answer after answer, and he was popping Manny Pacquiao with his jab. Again, keeping his high guard, kind of walking Manny Pacquiao down. And even when Manny Pacquiao would let his hands go, don't get me wrong, Pacquiao had his moments, but Yordenis Ugas was clearly winning the rounds to where by the time you start getting into the late rounds, you're like, damn, Manny Pacquiao is probably going to have to score a knockdown or two to really get back on the scorecards. Huge win for Yordenis Ugas, even though I feel like even though he beat Manny Pacquiao, he's not getting the full credit that a Manny Pacquiao win used to get you, because Manny Pacquiao, again, was 42 years old and was coming off 2 years of inactivity. So I don't think he's fully credited with the win, even though he looked very, very good and impressive in that victory over Pacquiao. So now what do I think between Errol Spence Jr. and Yordenis Ugas? Again, I think that this is going to be an elite chess match. I think it's going to be interesting to see if Errol Spence can do the things that he normally does with that right hand. Again, Yordenis Ugas isn't somebody who's just going to wait and let you start dictating things. I see Danny Garcia kind of acquiescing to losing rounds more readily than I see Yordenis Ugas at this stage of his career. And maybe that's unfair to Danny Garcia because he did fight a razor-close fight with Keith Thurman, prime Keith Thurman, and with Shawn Porter. But against Errol Spence Jr., it just seemed like if the other fights were 115 to 113-ish, Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia looked more like 116 to 112, 117, 111-ish, maybe even a little bit better than that. So Errol Spence beat Danny Garcia more convincingly than anybody I've seen beat Danny Garcia in the past. But Yordenis Ugas is such a spirited type of fighter, and he's somebody who, like Errol Spence, uses a lot of subtleties. Like, he likes to get the last punch of the exchange, that type of thing, where it goes a long way with the judges, right? So in the optics of things, Yordenis Ugas doesn't like to cede too much ground. He doesn't like to let you walk away with that one without having to answer for it. So I don't see Ugas just keeping the high guard and letting Errol Spence start working his way, throwing wide hooks around Ugas's guard and just kind of taking a step back and letting Errol Spence walk him down. This is going to be very interesting because both of these guys can lead and both of these guys can counter. And usually you would answer somebody who is left hand dominant by beating them with the straight right. But Spence isn't left hand dominant. He's right hand dominant who picks his spots with the left hand. So is Ugas going to try to offset Spence's right lead with his jab hand? Look, I'm a little bit concerned about them clashing heads just because that's something that you'll get in righty versus southpaw. But also it's going to be interesting to watch that lead foot battle and see who is able to establish the mastery of the angles. In that regard, I slightly favor Errol Spence. He's got very sophisticated movement. Again, he's not happy-footed, he's not bouncing, but he is stepping and sliding in such an effective way. And because Ugas kind of keeps that high guard, I'm not saying that he's going to be blinding himself with the high guard. And again, he does throw very effective counters. But I see Errol Spence as being the slightly busier fighter round over round to where the activity that he's going to try to deploy with that lead hand might do enough to kind of create the impression that he is getting the better out of the exchange. It's also going to be interesting to see who wins the battle between the scooping power shots. Errol Spence's scooping left-handed body shots versus Ugas's kind of right uppercuts and sweeping left-handed shots. This is going to be very interesting, and it should be noted that Ugas is also 35 years old, whereas Errol Spence is 32. That might come into play in the middle to late rounds here because Errol Spence is a pretty strong finisher. Ugas doesn't fade either, but he really doesn't fade. He looked pretty good against Manny Pacquiao and against Shawn Porter in the late rounds. So, look, I think that Errol Spence's accuracy, even though Ugas is also a very accurate puncher, but Manny Pacquiao was 42 years old. Ugas did have a split decision win over Abel Ramos, who I don't think would have been that competitive against Errol Spence Jr. Abel Ramos is a good fighter. I don't think he would have been that competitive with Errol Spence. I've got to go Errol Spence via 116 to 112-ish type decision against Ugas. I do think that he's going to establish some activity that's going to go unanswered with his use of the lead right hand. Again, I think that that is becoming one of the most effective punches in boxing, pound for pound, is Errol Spence's lead right. I do think that he's going to have more unanswered moments with that right hand than anything Ugas is going to do. When Ugas lets his hands go, I think Errol Spence is going to try to counter on top of a lot of that. And I think that he's going to be working Ugas's body in the beginning, middle, and late rounds to where it can slow Ugas's output a bit by the middle and late rounds to where Errol Spence can start edging some of these critical rounds to where, again, I think that it's going to be a close decision. I think there are going to be a lot of swing rounds here. I don't think Errol Spence is just going to be in cruise control and dominant to a 118, 110, 117, 111 type scorecard. And it's hard to picture either one of these guys stopping the other because I just feel like both of them are super durable. Even though I still do kind of have questions on how Errol Spence is truly going to respond once he starts getting tagged around that eye area. Is he going to be gun shy at all? Is he going to be tepid? Is he going to start thinking in the ring about the eye issue? If he is able to reemerge like Superman the way that he was after that car accident, then I think that he wins 116-112. If either the accident does have a lingering effect or that eye injury has any sort of an effect, then you can easily see how Ugas could pull out a decision win here. I just think that it's more likely that we get Errol Spence Jr. to win via close but somewhat clear decision. So the question then is, if Errol Spence does win over Ugas, again, this is a big if. This is about as close a call as I can recall from an Errol Spence fight. The only other fights that I could think of having as many questions as I do coming into this one were against Kell Brook, and probably Shawn Porter, maybe Danny Garcia, but that was more so because of the car accident. If Errol Spence is able to come out of this with 3 of the 4 welterweight belts, there is nothing else that needs to happen besides Terence Crawford signing with Al Haymon, or maybe signing with Pro Bellum and then doing some sort of a cross-promotional thing, but fat chance of that. We just don't see too many cross-promotional PBC fights, but we have seen a couple, including Shawn Porter versus Terence Crawford, even though the circumstances are different, because Terence Crawford was kind of the A-side fighter coming from Top Rank, or should I say Shawn Porter coming from PBC to fight the A-side Terence Crawford in that case. In this case, Errol Spence is holding the cards and 3 of the 4 belts. Terence Crawford would be coming in with 1 belt. So the only way I could see this one happening is if Terence Crawford does sign with PBC. And then we could get that fight that we've been looking forward to very frustratedly. Like, it's been a pretty grueling wait, to the point where I worry that Terence Crawford will be in his mid-30s by the time this fight happens. And if Terence Crawford is 35, 36 by the time Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Crawford happens, then we might end up getting a great fight still. But I think that it's past the ideal window where you've got prime versus prime. Like, I still have questions whether we got prime versus prime in Canelo versus Triple G 1, let alone 2. So yeah, if Spence beats Ugas, Spence doesn't need to fight anybody else. He shouldn't fight anybody else. And every sanctioning body needs to stand down. Just get out of the way and let this happen, right? I don't need a mandatory to pop up and say, but you got to fight this. Nah, none of that. From the WBO, which is the belt that Terence Crawford holds, nor from any of the 3 belts that Spence will hold if he beats Yordenis Ugas here. Terence Crawford shouldn't be fighting anybody else. Errol Spence shouldn't be fighting anybody else. It needs to be Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Crawford. And if it doesn't happen, let's not even go there. Let me know what you think about Errol Spence Jr. versus Yordenis Ugas. Who do you have winning and how? And what do you expect to happen in the wake of Errol Spence Jr. versus Yordenis Ugas? Please let me know in the comments. I can't wait. This is a very, very competitive fight on paper, and I expect it to play out as a very competitive fight in the ring. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.